Richard Nixon didn't fear the Soviets. He didn't fear protests, reporters, or war. What he feared was silence behind closed doors. That's why he recorded everything. And in the end, those tapes destroyed him. In 1960, Richard Nixon stood on the edge of power. He was vice president under Eisenhower, sharp, driven, endlessly ambitious. And yet, in his first presidential bid, he lost. To John F. Kennedy, barely. It was a razor-thin defeat. Fewer than 120,000 votes separated them. Nixon, gaunt and pale from a grueling campaign, debated a young, charismatic opponent who charmed the camera. While JFK smiled, Nixon sweated, and in the television age, sweat was fatal. 2 years later, in 1962, Nixon tried to become governor of California, a move many saw as a step backward. He lost again. Worse than losing, he gave a now infamous press conference, bitter and visibly angry. "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." The press rolled its eyes. America moved on. Political pundits wrote his obituary. Nixon was done. Over. A political ghost, wandering Washington with no place to haunt. But America was changing, and chaos was seeping into every corner of national life. The Vietnam War was escalating. Cities were burning with riots and protests. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April 1968, Robert F. Kennedy in June. College campuses exploded in fury. The Democratic Party itself was imploding on live television. The country was tired of violence, tired of confusion, tired of revolution. And into this storm walked Richard Nixon. He was older now, harder, more calculating, but he understood one thing better than anyone: fear, and how to speak to it. "The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker," he would say. But beneath the words was something colder, a tactical mind reading the pulse of a wounded nation. In 1968, Nixon re-entered the race for the presidency. People laughed at first. The same man who had quit after California, who lost to the golden boy JFK. He had no chance, but Nixon had learned a secret. Politics wasn't about inspiration. It was about timing. While liberals argued in the streets, Nixon quietly built his coalition, the silent majority. Middle Americans, suburban families, Southern conservatives. The voters who didn't protest, didn't march, but voted and feared the direction of the country. He promised law and order, a phrase with weight, with meaning. It meant protection, stability, a return to something familiar, even if that familiar had never truly existed. His campaign was disciplined, controlled, and surprisingly modern. He avoided debates. He ran heavily on television. He stayed on message. No outbursts, no sweat. Behind the scenes, his team, including strategist Roger Ailes, transformed Nixon into a TV-ready figure. Calm, fatherly, strong. Not loved, but respected. Feared even, and in 1968, that was enough. By November, he had done the unthinkable. Nixon won. Richard Nixon, the man written off as politically dead, was the new president of the United States. It was one of the greatest comebacks in American political history. But this wasn't a fairy tale. He didn't win by uniting the country. He won by dividing it differently. He didn't charm the public. He cornered their fears. He didn't reinvent himself. He refined his weapons. And in doing so, Nixon proved something that would shape American politics for decades. You don't need to be beloved to be powerful. You just need to understand what people fear and give them an enemy. He gave them crime, disorder, protesters, the liberal elite, the media. He gave them someone to blame. But beneath the surface of that victory was something darker, something festering. The same bitterness from 1962, the same resentment toward the press, the same distrust of elites, the same belief that the system was out to get him. The comeback had worked, but Nixon hadn't changed, and that would be the beginning of his end. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969, America was exhausted. The Vietnam War was dragging on, costing lives and credibility. The Cold War dominated every policy decision. The world was locked in a zero-sum game, communism versus capitalism, and the board was frozen. But Nixon saw something different. He didn't just want to play the game, he wanted to rewire it. At the heart of his strategy was a bold, almost heretical idea for that time. China and the Soviet Union weren't one communist bloc. They were rivals. And if he could drive a wedge between them, he could shift the entire global balance of power. This was not a move for the timid. The U.S. hadn't even formally recognized the People's Republic of China. Official American maps still marked Taiwan as China. U.S. citizens couldn't legally travel to the mainland. And yet, Nixon reached out, in secret. In 1971, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger flew to China on a clandestine mission. He met with Premier Zhou Enlai. Negotiations began quietly. And then, in February 1972, the impossible happened. Richard Nixon, the staunch anti-communist, the man who built his career attacking the Red Menace, stepped off a plane in Beijing. The images were surreal. American television showed Nixon toasting Mao Zedong, walking the Great Wall, smiling with Chinese leaders. This was the week that changed the world, Nixon declared. And in many ways, he was right. China and the U.S. didn't become allies overnight. But the visit shattered decades of diplomatic silence. It isolated the Soviet Union. It forced Moscow to reconsider its position. And Nixon wasn't done. He turned next to the USSR. At the height of the arms race, while both nations stockpiled nuclear weapons, Nixon believed in diplomacy backed by strength. He called it peace through strength, a calculated blend of pressure and dialogue. In May 1972, just 3 months after visiting China, Nixon landed in Moscow. He met with General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev. They signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT-1, the first formal attempt to limit nuclear weapons. It was unprecedented. The very idea that the two great superpowers could agree to restrain themselves, even partially, was groundbreaking. "What we have done here," Nixon said, "will not be remembered simply for its immediate political impact. It will be remembered as a step toward survival." Meanwhile, back in Southeast Asia, Nixon pursued another front, Vietnam. When he took office, over 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam. Nixon didn't believe in simply pulling out. He feared humiliation, the so-called domino effect, the idea that one communist victory would cause others. So he launched a strategy called Vietnamization, shifting the fighting to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. At the same time, he escalated bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos and authorized secret operations. It was brutal and controversial. But by 1973, American combat troops were gone. And in 1975, the war ended. The cost was enormous, in lives, trust, and truth. But Nixon had done something rare. He ended a war he inherited and changed the chessboard it was part of, Nixon's global vision. Nixon's foreign policy wasn't about morality. It was about realism. He saw the world not in terms of good versus evil, but in terms of leverage, pressure, and survival. This was the doctrine of realpolitik, practicality over ideology, deals over dreams. He understood that power wasn't just military, it was diplomatic, it was psychological, it was visual. The image of Nixon shaking hands with Mao sent a message louder than any speech. The Cold War had new rules. While his domestic presidency was increasingly turbulent, abroad he was respected, even admired. Foreign leaders saw Nixon as complex, unpredictable, but effective. Brezhnev toasted him with vodka. Zhou Enlai debated him in Mandarin. And America, for a brief moment, seemed like it could do the impossible, talk to both enemies at once. The price of genius. But behind the handshakes and flashbulbs, Nixon's insecurities never disappeared. He feared leaks. He distrusted diplomats. He recorded conversations in the Oval Office, not for history, but for control. His victories abroad stood in contrast to the storm building at home, because while Nixon played global chess with brilliance, he was sowing the seeds of his own collapse. The same paranoia that helped him outmaneuver adversaries would eventually destroy him. But in that moment, in 1972, he stood at the height of his power. He had done the unthinkable. He opened China. He restrained the Soviets. He began to end the most divisive war in modern U.S. history. Few presidents have reshaped the world in just 4 years. Fewer still have done it while fighting enemies both abroad and within, and none have fallen so hard, so soon after flying so high. Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968 by presenting himself as a stabilizer, a strong, calculating leader in a chaotic world. But inside the White House, a different man emerged, one not driven by calm, but consumed by control. He didn't just dislike the press, he hated them. He didn't just fear political opposition, he believed enemies were everywhere, hiding, leaking, conspiring. And so he fought shadows with real weapons. The lists. It began with a list. Actually, several. Officially called the Opponents List. It was a document maintained by Nixon's aides, cataloging journalists, activists, politicians, celebrities, anyone who had crossed, insulted, or challenged him. On it were names like Paul Newman, actor, Daniel Shore, journalist, Edward Kennedy, senator, Jane Fonda. The purpose? To screw them, in Nixon's words. Use the IRS to audit them, he said. Block their government contracts. Freeze their access. These weren't empty threats. The administration used federal agencies to intimidate critics. What began as political strategy turned into government-sanctioned retaliation. The tapes then came the tapes. In 1971, Nixon installed a voice-activated recording system in the White House. Every word, every conversation, every whisper in the Oval Office, cabinet room, and other key locations was captured on tape. Why? Control, leverage, paranoia. He wanted records, not for history, but for protection, for blackmail if needed. He didn't trust advisors. He didn't trust memory. Only recordings told the truth, in his view. Ironically, it was those very tapes that would one day bring him down. The leaks. Nixon's obsession with leaks began in earnest after the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Daniel Ellsberg, a former defense analyst, released top-secret documents detailing how the U.S. government had lied about the Vietnam War. Nixon was furious, not just at the leak, but at the idea that someone inside the system could defy him. If one person could do it, others could follow. Thus was born the White House Plumbers, a secret team assembled not to fix faucets, but to plug leaks, literally. They broke into psychiatrists' offices, tailed journalists, and gathered dirt on perceived enemies. They operated outside normal legal channels. Often they didn't even report to official cabinet members. It was a government within a government. And it answered only to Nixon, the culture of loyalty. In public, Nixon called for unity. In private, he demanded loyalty, absolute, unquestioning, personal loyalty. Cabinet members were expected not to question him. Staff were judged not by competence, but by allegiance. When Attorney General John Mitchell resigned to run Nixon's campaign, he said, "I would do anything the president asked me to do, even if it meant going to jail." That wasn't metaphor, because inside Nixon's administration, many believed they were above the law, that the rules didn't apply, because they were the guardians of America's soul, the last defense against chaos. So they spied. They wiretapped reporters. They monitored anti-war groups. They infiltrated Democratic offices, and they believed it was necessary. When the president does it, Nixon would later argue, that means it's not illegal. That one line, cold, calculated, and deeply revealing, captured the mindset that had taken over the West Wing. Nixon versus the world. By 1972, Nixon was at the height of his power. He had just returned from historic trips to China and Moscow. His approval ratings soared. His re-election campaign was heading for a landslide. But instead of relaxing, he intensified his internal war. Because the world outside didn't frighten Nixon as much as the world within. The liberals in the press, the demonstrators in the streets, the bureaucrats in Washington. He believed they were conspiring against him, and in turn he conspired against them. He created enemies even when none existed. He attacked before being attacked. He saw betrayal as inevitable, and loyalty as a test that never ended. The spiral. What began as tight management turned into obsession. What started as political cunning evolved into full-blown paranoia. By the time the Watergate break-in occurred, when 5 men were arrested inside Democratic headquarters, Nixon didn't even need to give direct orders. The machine was already running. Loyalists acted on what they believed he wanted. The culture he built of secrecy, loyalty, control had a logic of its own. And when the scandal began to unfold, Nixon didn't confess. He covered up. He demanded silence. He ordered lies. He obstructed justice. Because for Nixon, the real crime wasn't burglary, it was exposure, shadows in the West Wing. In his final months, the White House became a fortress. He drank more. He trusted less. He ranted about enemies in late-night phone calls, recorded by his own system. The same president who had achieved peace abroad now couldn't find peace in his own mind. "Always remember," he once told an aide, "others may hate you. But those who hate you don't win unless you hate them back. And then you destroy yourself." He didn't realize he was talking about himself. Nixon's presidency was a paradox. A brilliant statesman and a suspicious, wounded man. A leader who brought peace with China and war with his own government. A president who built walls not just on borders but in his own house. He won by controlling chaos. But eventually, he became the source of it. And as history would show, paranoia is the enemy no wall can keep out. It started like a small-time crime. Just after 2 a.m. on June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. They had broken into an office inside the Watergate complex, a sleek, modern building near the Potomac River. They wore suits and latex gloves. They had cameras, bugs, and bundles of cash in $100 bills. At first glance, it looked like a botched burglary. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of the end, not only for Nixon's presidency, but for the public's trust in government. The break-in, the 5 men, later known as the Watergate burglars, weren't common criminals. They were connected to a group called the White House Plumbers, the same secret team Nixon had created to stop leaks. One of the burglars, James McCord, was a former CIA operative and worked directly with Nixon's re-election campaign, the Committee to Re-elect the President, known ironically as CREEP. So why break in? Officially to install wiretaps and collect intel on the Democrats. Unofficially, no one really knows how deep the plan went. The theories ranged from political sabotage to blackmail operations. But one thing was clear. It wasn't just a freelance job. It had White House fingerprints all over it, the initial cover-up. At first, Nixon dismissed it. Publicly, he called it a third-rate burglary. Behind the scenes, however, his administration moved quickly to distance itself and to shut it down. They pressured the FBI to stop investigating. They instructed aides to lie under oath. They raised hush money, tens of thousands of dollars in cash, to keep the burglars quiet. All of this would have remained in the shadows. If not for 2 things, a pair of persistent reporters and one secret tape recorder the press strikes back at the Washington Post, 2 young journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, started digging. What began as routine reporting turned into a relentless investigation. They followed the money. They tracked connections between the burglars and high-ranking Nixon officials. They were guided by an anonymous source, known only as Deep Throat, later revealed to be FBI Deputy Director Mark Felt. As the White House denied everything, the Post kept publishing. Bit by bit, the threads began to unravel. The Senate investigation. In early 1973, the U.S. Senate launched formal hearings on Watergate. The country watched, live, as former White House aides were grilled under oath. One aide, Alexander Butterfield, dropped a bombshell. Nixon recorded everything, every conversation, every meeting. Suddenly, there was a way to prove whether the president was lying. And that changed everything. Congress demanded the tapes. Nixon refused. He cited executive privilege, the idea that the president could withhold certain information for national security. But it wasn't about national security. It was about self-preservation, and the nation knew it. The smoking gun. After months of legal battles, Nixon finally released transcripts of some tapes. They were heavily edited, full of gaps, including the now infamous 18-and-a-half-minute erasure from a crucial recording. But even the fragments were damning. Then, in August 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously. Nixon had to release the tapes in full, and one tape, dated June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the break-in, sealed his fate. On it, Nixon was heard instructing his staff to tell the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. It was obstruction of justice. It was the smoking gun. Collapse. With the tape public, support for Nixon evaporated. Even his closest allies turned away. The Republican leadership told him impeachment was inevitable, and conviction likely. Rather than face trial in the Senate, Nixon chose to resign. On August 8, 1974, he gave a televised address from the Oval Office. "I have never been a quitter," he said, voice shaking. "But as president, I must put the interests of America first." The next morning, he boarded a helicopter on the White House lawn. As it lifted into the sky, he gave a stiff wave, 2 fingers raised in a V victory, defiance. No one knew for sure. He was the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. Aftermath, Vice President Gerald Ford became president. A month later, he issued a full pardon for Nixon, saying the nation needed to heal. The decision was controversial. Some saw it as mercy, others as betrayal. But one thing was clear. The presidency would never be the same. Watergate changed everything. Trust in government plummeted. Campaign finance laws were overhauled. A new generation of investigative journalism was born, and every scandal since has been compared to it, with Gate added to the name. Legacy of the scandal. In the end, the Watergate break-in was small, stupid even, a pointless burglary. But it wasn't about the crime. It was about the cover-up, the lies, the abuse of power, the belief that the presidency made one untouchable. That belief collapsed, not just for Nixon, but for the nation. And while Nixon insisted even years later that he never profited from Watergate, the damage was done. His legacy would forever be split in two: the brilliant strategist who opened China and the paranoid man who erased his own presidency. By the summer of 1974, Richard Nixon's presidency was collapsing. Not in one moment, but piece by piece, like a slow, grinding avalanche. What began as a third-rate burglary had now grown into a full-blown constitutional crisis. The Senate Watergate hearings had exposed corruption, lies, and abuse of power. The Justice Department was circling, and Congress, once cautious, was preparing to strike. At the center of it all were the tapes. The evidence mounts. From the very beginning, Nixon had insisted on his innocence. "I am not a crook," he famously declared in front of the press in 1973. "I earned everything I've got." But his own voice told a different story. The White House tapes, first revealed during Senate hearings, captured conversations in Nixon's inner sanctum. They exposed how he and his closest advisors discussed obstructing justice, paying hush money, and using federal agencies to target opponents. The content was undeniable. Each new tape released to the public chipped away at his support, not just among Democrats, but within his own Republican Party. Isolation. By mid-1974, Nixon was a man alone. His closest aides, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, had resigned or been indicted. The press was relentless. Public trust had evaporated. Approval ratings fell below 25%. In private, Nixon raged, drank, and wandered the White House late at night in emotional breakdowns. He believed he was being hunted. He believed the elites were out to destroy him. He believed still in his greatness, but the walls were closing in. Articles of impeachment. On July 27, 1974, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, contempt of Congress. It was now only a matter of time. Republican leaders visited Nixon privately. They told him the truth. He had lost the party. He would be impeached in the House. He would be convicted in the Senate. There was no deal, no path forward. Only one exit remained: the resignation. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Nixon addressed the nation on live television. He sat at the resolute desk, composed, calm, almost detached. "I have never been a quitter," he began. "But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow." It was surreal. The most powerful man in the world was stepping down. Not for war, not for scandal involving others, but for his own misdeeds. The next morning, on August 9th, Nixon walked out onto the South Lawn, his family by his side. White House staff lined up, silent. He boarded the Marine One helicopter. Before stepping inside, he turned and gave a final wave, both arms raised, fingers forming the V for victory sign. It was defiant, iconic, and strange. The nation reacts Americans watched, stunned. Some wept, some cheered, some simply felt empty. Never before had a U.S. president resigned from office. It was unprecedented, unthinkable, and yet somehow inevitable. Later that day, Vice President Gerald Ford took the oath of office. "Our long national nightmare is over," he said. But was it? The country was left wounded, institutions shaken, cynicism rising. Trust in government had been broken, perhaps permanently. The pardon 1 month later, on September 8, 1974, President Ford did something extraordinary. He granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he may have committed as president. Ford said it was to help the nation heal, to move on, to stop the bleeding. But many saw it as betrayal, a backroom deal, a whitewashing of justice. Public outrage exploded. Ford's approval ratings plunged. Some historians believe it cost him the 1976 election, but Nixon was spared criminal trial. He had fallen, but not entirely. Life after the presidency. After resigning, Nixon returned to California. He was broken, politically, financially, and emotionally. For months, he lived in near isolation. At one point, he was hospitalized with phlebitis and a dangerous blood clot. Some feared he would not survive the stress. But slowly he began to reemerge. He wrote books, granted interviews, reframed his legacy. On foreign policy, many still respected him. Presidents, even ones who once opposed him, began to seek his advice. In time, Nixon became a kind of elder statesman, though he never fully escaped the shadow of Watergate. "I let down my friends, I let down the country, I let down our system of government," he would later admit. "But most of all, I let down myself." A presidency in 2 halves. The tragedy of Richard Nixon was never that he lacked intelligence, or skill, or vision. It was that he believed the rules didn't apply to him. He saw enemies everywhere, and in fighting them became his own worst enemy. His fall was not due to ideology or incompetence. It was due to fear, pride, and the belief that power justified anything. He won 49 states in 1972 and resigned less than 2 years later. It is one of the most astonishing collapses in political history. Epilogue. When Nixon died in 1994, 4 U.S. presidents attended his funeral. He was remembered for his achievements and for his failures. His name will forever be linked to one word: Watergate. But his story is more than scandal. It's a warning, a lesson, that even in democracy, power can corrupt, that even the most brilliant minds can fall, that paranoia once planted grows roots, and that in the end no man, not even the president, is above the law. Richard Nixon's life was a contradiction, and so was his legacy. He left the presidency in shame, resigned in disgrace, pardoned but never forgiven. And yet, in the years that followed, even his harshest critics were forced to admit a more uncomfortable truth. He was brilliant, he was visionary, and he changed the world. The diplomat in the shadows before Nixon, no American president had ever set foot in China. He opened the door, and in doing so, reshaped global geopolitics. That single move not only changed U.S.-China relations, it altered the structure of the Cold War itself. It pulled Beijing out of Moscow's orbit and gave the United States leverage in a bipolar world. Then he turned to the Soviets. The Salt-Wye Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and the new era of détente, all signed under Nixon. For a man with a reputation as a hawk, he brokered peace more effectively than most peacemakers. Even in Vietnam, though his actions were brutal, controversial, and morally murky, he brought the war to an end. After years of escalation, it was Nixon who finally extracted American troops. The irony? Nixon was a cold warrior who wanted peace, and he achieved it, even as he destroyed himself at home. The reformer who distrusted reform domestically, Nixon also left an imprint few remember. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. He signed into law the Clean Air Act, expanded Social Security, and enforced desegregation in Southern schools more than any president before him. He even proposed universal health care, a plan more progressive than anything passed in the decades after. And yet, he governed from the shadows, always suspicious, always watching, never trusting the very system he was trying to improve. Nixon didn't believe in institutions. He believed in himself. He didn't build consensus. He outmaneuvered opponents. That mindset may have won battles, but it cost him the war. A mind too sharp, a skin too thin. Nixon's intelligence was never in doubt. He read voraciously, understood foreign policy on a level few presidents have matched. He had a long-term view of power and a deep grasp of strategy. But emotionally, he was fragile. He obsessed over insults. He held grudges. He saw enemies where there were none, and loyalty tests where there was only disagreement. "Always remember," he once said, "others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them back, and then you destroy yourself." It was a prophecy about himself. Nixon was not taken down by his policies. He was taken down by his personality. The dual legacy. So how should history remember Richard Nixon? As the paranoid manipulator who lied to the American people, or as the brilliant statesman who helped prevent nuclear war? The answer is both. He was a president of opposites. The outsider who became the ultimate insider. The law and order candidate who broke the law. The anti-communist crusader who made peace with communists. The champion of conservative values who expanded liberal programs. There is no neat narrative, only tension, only contrast. The rehabilitation and its limits. In the years after Watergate, Nixon lived a quiet life. He gave interviews, wrote books. Gradually, presidents, Reagan, Bush, even Clinton, began to seek his advice, especially on foreign policy. By the 1990s, he was no longer a villain, not exactly a hero, more like a wise, disgraced oracle. And when he died in 1994, there was something striking about his funeral. 4 U.S. presidents attended. Flags were lowered. Praise was given, cautiously, selectively, but sincerely. He achieved great things, they said, but he was flawed. He loved his country, maybe too much. It was a kind of redemption, but never an erasure. The deeper warning. Nixon's downfall wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It showed how far a president could stretch power before the system fought back. He used intelligence agencies for political purposes. He punished critics with federal muscle. He built a culture of fear inside government. And in doing so, he raised a question that still haunts American democracy. How much power is too much, even for the most capable hands? Watergate became a cautionary tale, but it wasn't the last scandal. And Nixon wasn't the last president to test limits. His genius left a mark. So did his downfall. The final word. In the end, Richard Nixon won nearly everything he ever wanted. The presidency, a global legacy, strategic influence that reshaped the Cold War. But he lost the one thing he could never regain, the trust of the people. "I gave them a sword," he said in his final interviews, "and they stuck it in, and they twisted it with relish. But the truth is, he forged that sword himself. He sharpened it with paranoia, wielded it against enemies, real and imagined, and never once put it down." Richard Nixon died not as a villain or a hero, but as something more unsettling, a tragic genius, brilliant, broken, unforgettable, and forever divided between what he achieved and what he destroyed.